Evening with a Legend is a series of presentations exclusive to legends of the famous 24 Hours of Le Mans, giving us an opportunity to bring a piece of Le Mans to you. By sharing stories and highlights of the big event, you get a chance to become part of the legend of Le Mans with guests from different eras of over 100 years of racing.
Tonight, we have an opportunity to bring a piece of Le Mans to you, sharing in the legend of Le Mans with guests from different eras of over 100 years of racing. And as your host, I'm delighted to introduce Butch Leitzinger. Best known as an ALMS driver with Dyson Racing, he has also driven for a variety of other teams and race series. He's a three-time winner of the Daytona 24 Hours in 1994, 97, and 99. He won two IMSA Drivers' Championship titles in both 97 and 98 while driving for Dyson Racing, and he was named 2002 Rookie of the Year in the Trans Am Series and has raced in both the Nextel and Busch NASCAR Series. Butch has attempted to conquer the 24 Hours of Le Mans 6 times in his career, driving for Panoz in 97 and 99, Team Cadillac in 2000, then clinching a podium with Bentley in 2001, and returning to Bentley in 2002 with a final run with Risi Competizione in 2003. And he's here with us tonight to share his motorsports journey. And with that, I'm your host, Crew Chief Eric from the Motoring Podcast Network, welcoming everyone to this Evening with a Legend. Butch, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric.
Like all good stories, there's an origin. So take us on your road to Le Mans. What led you up to your first race in 97?
Well, the first time I was ever actually at Le Mans was 1994. I drove the Nissan 300ZX Turbo, and we won at Daytona. And that meant an invite to Le Mans with Nissan. But I was only in the second car. And I was, the reason I was even in the car in the first place was as a reward because I won GTU championship the year before. I've been trying to go to Le Mans for forever. So it was always kind of like, well, we don't have the budget for a second car. And they had Paul Gentilozzi in the second car, and he had some means. And Eric Vanderpool had some sponsorship with Lease Plan, but they had a third seat that still wasn't filled. Frank Hanswitz was running Nissan Motorsports, and so I was bugging him all the time, get me there, get me there. And I made the mistake of saying, just get me over there. And if I can't drive, I'll do tires for you. And I kind of said that as a throwaway comment, but came back to bite me because I got sent over there 2 weeks early because they found out that I took French in high school. Went over with Gary Cummings, who was doing the advanced prep for it. And so I spent 2 weeks kind of preparing for the team to come over, still not knowing if I was going to drive. That was given, I think, about an hour's warning. I live in State College, Pennsylvania. I got a phone call that said, okay, we have a flight for you out of Newark in about 6 hours, and it's about 4 hours away. So I had to throw my stuff in a bag and hightail it for the airport. And it was still just like the hope that maybe third seat wouldn't be filled. It eventually was filled. A gentleman that had some backing from a Japanese television station. So then I spent the week of race week being a tire buster, just taking the tires back and forth. But still, as an American in 1994, Le Mans, like right now, there's quite a bit of transfer between the U.S. and Le Mans. There's like a lot of teams, a lot of cars make the trip pretty easily. Back then, it was much more rare. There wasn't that much representation of Americans at Le Mans. It had always been a dream of mine to be at Le Mans, preferably to race, but just to be there. So this was quite possibly my one chance to ever get there. Having said all that, how wonderful it was to be there, I would not do it again as a crew member because that was a long, long day.
So up until that point, had you raced in Europe yet?
I had not. The only thing that I'd done, not in Europe, but in Japan a few times, there was an invitation some of the IMSA teams had from a Japanese group to bring the GT cars over. And we raced at Fuji twice and at Autopolis once. Yeah, so this was my first time racing in Europe as well.
So the first time you go to Le Mans, you're there as crew, let's just say, hoping that they need a driver to fill in and you're anxious that you got your helmet ready and all that. What was your first impression of Le Mans, even as a worker bee or as a spectator? What did you think of it compared to the tracks you had been running in the States?
It was really impressive. I had never seen that level of facility before. This was right after they had built the main complex, the old pit complex, quite famous, but also quite famous for not being modern standards. But so it was truly impressive seeing that level at a road course, because in the States at the time in 1994, like Watkins Glen and trying to think of other tracks that we have in the States, most of them hadn't been updated from 1970s, so it was impressive to see just even that level of facility at the time. And then once getting to the circuit itself, it was really impressive. In my 2 weeks I was there before the race, being able to drive on the course itself and trying to imagine when there weren't, lorries going back and forth on the road with groceries and things that there's cars going 200 and whatever miles an hour on it. It was kind of the culmination of reading magazines for 20 years at that point.
So earlier that year, like you said, you won the Daytona 24 Hours in 1994. How did you put the deal together with Panoz, and who helped you along the way?
I benefited a lot from relationships that I had. I'd driven with James Weaver and Andy Wallace at Dyson Racing from 1995, and we got along really well. We were very compatible as co-drivers, and we had quite a bit of success. Actually, we won Daytona 24 Hours together beginning of 97. And Don Panoz in 1997 had decided that he wanted to go to Le Mans. And he did it, in a typically Don Panoz way of didn't do it by half. And he went in, he had Adrian Reynard build him a car, and he had David Price run the team for him at Le Mans. Both James and Andy had very good relationships with David. Andy had driven the McLaren F1 with Price's team. So they were like really good mates. So when it came time to get a third driver for Le Mans, they just kind of poked him and said, why don't you take a look at Butch? And he said, who's that? And he refused to call me Butch. From the moment I met him, he said, Butch now. And if you know Pricey, there's quite a few other words that were thrown in there, but he just said, you're Buzz Lightyear. So from then on, he just called me Buzz. But yeah, so I was able to just kind of get dragged in through my friends.
So you get to Le Mans. At that moment, were you comparing and contrasting Daytona to Le Mans? Were you making those comparisons, or was it just on a totally different level?
It was a totally different level. This was where I benefited hugely with James and Andy being my teammates. And not only that they convinced Pricey to hire me, but before any of us went on the track, we went around the track and they gave me tips the entire way around, a lot of things to remember. And also, really, one of the things they did was put into me how dangerous this place is. The speeds that the cars are going, there's often enormous accidents. And, actually one of the greatest tips that they gave me was because the straights are so long that it's a little bit easy to kind of lose concentration. You start looking at the gauges and, okay, like you start making notes like, oh, remember to tell them that when I come in and the tire pressures are this, and then miss your braking marker because you've been going down the straight for the last 20 seconds or whatever it was, opposed to most normal racetracks where it's just constantly turn. It's a different rhythm to it there. But yeah, so it was a big help having them to really bring me up to speed on the seriousness of the track. And then in spite of being there, you're there for the Wednesday, Thursday, with quite a bit of practice time, but most of that goes away pretty quickly, and then actually we had pre-qualifying then, but every lap of pre-qualifying was taken up with Andy Wallace driving because we didn't have very much speed. We got in by the skin of our teeth, actually both for pre-qualifying and qualifying itself, because that year they invited to the race more people than were going to start. So I think it was 2 cars were going to have to go through all qualifying and then not be able to race. And we were almost that car. Just because the car wasn't what it would eventually become. We were struggling a lot with power and with a lot of reliability problems with the car. But yeah, so all pre-qualifying was taken up with Andy driving. So I never drove in pre-qualifying. For the race weekend, if I remember right, I got a few laps in a night practice. That was pretty eye-opening in every kind of way. I went out at night. It's not like Daytona where everything's lit up. Even, the lights were fairly decent, but you're very quickly driving past your headlights at 200 miles an hour. And I remember somebody blew an engine. So there's oil all over the track. So they had local yellows, and a bit of a shock to me coming from the US, but the way they would handle the yellows was there'd be a course worker, there were people spreading oil dry out on the track, and then a course worker just standing on the road, on the racetrack with a little reflective light to catch your headlights. That was quite a shock to me. Like in the States, it would probably be a red flag, everyone in the pits, well, we take care of this stuff. That wasn't the mechanism there. So I kind of had to get a little more aware of the difference in attitude, I suppose, between the US and Europe. And then I did the warm up before the race. So maybe 6 or 7 laps before the race itself, which is a fairly common thing. And keep in mind, 6 or 7 laps is still quite a bit of miles. You don't have that as much repetition to really be able to extract a great lap time out of the car just because you don't have the experience yet.
You brought us into 97, and you were no stranger to endurance racing by this point. And you were still sort of talking about the comparing and contrasting of Daytona and Le Mans here. Daytona, like you said, a lot of turns. You'll do 200 miles an hour, but you'll do it for a brief period of time. And then you got to come deep into turn 1 and just lose all your speed and kind of start the whole process over again, as we know. But the physical demands of Le Mans, not only the mental demands of that concentration of running at night and changes in weather conditions, because that's inevitably what happens at Le Mans because it's so big. After being there in 94 and then 97 and continuing your attempts, how did you have to physically prepare for something as big as Le Mans compared to the races you were doing stateside?
Le Mans doesn't beat you up as much as Daytona, but it's very different mentally. Daytona, the real issue, at least in the day, is that, you might have 70 cars on the track at the start of the race. The feeling was literally like one of those video games where those cars just kind of meandering all around, and you're meant to be able to slice through all these little jammer cars. Yeah, you were just constantly evading cars and slicing through traffic. So at Daytona, your lap time might vary by 5 seconds a lap easily. You hopefully avoided a few crashes and things like that. And you come around, an experienced crew chief would just look at that and say, well, he must have had a few things happen that lap, but that wouldn't be a cause of alarm or anything. At Le Mans, because there were only, at the time I'd raced, I think it was 48 cars over 8 miles of track. So every lap is almost qualifying. You don't really have much traffic. And one of the things about Le Mans is that because the laps are so long, the team managers don't have a whole lot else to do except for look at at their notebook and look at what lap time you just turned. And so, they stare at that for 4 minutes or, 3 minutes 50, whatever it was, and just think, well, Butch is a little bit slow today. Oh, that last lap was 2 seconds slower than the lap before. I think you might be losing it. Just from being able to keep your job, or get a job for next year, you really have to kind of impress them every lap and, really kind of have the car standing on its nose. At Daytona, if you made it around for the lap, it was a good lap. And at Le Mans, you really had to be with a good lap time. So that was the biggest change in mental, how to go into the race. At Daytona, you really had to take care of the car, make sure that you didn't have any bodywork damage or anything just from touching other cars. And at Le Mans, there weren't that many opportunities to.
So in 97, you ran the Panoz GTR1, which is in the same realm of cars, let's say the Corvettes and the Vipers and things like that we saw here stateside in ALMS, which the Esperante GTR1 is one of the more memorable cars from that era by far. I mean, it's instantly recognizable. The next time you come to Le Mans in 99, you come back with the infamous Panoz LMP Roadster, and you're partnered with David Brabham and Eric Bernard. Obviously, Don Panoz wants to keep you on staff. Is that how the story goes? How did you come back to run with Panoz for a second time?
In 97, we didn't have much success, really. We had quite a few problems. Then in 98, Don expanded the team quite a bit and had a lot of really high talent drivers for the whole year. They didn't need someone to come in just for the one race at Le Mans. But for 99, they actually had switched, and Tony Dow had run the program in 98. Then he let Tony Dow go, and Tony Fox came in and ran the team. And it was kind of run a little bit smaller. They didn't have kind of a cast of 1,000 drivers. Went back to, they had 2 drivers per car for the year, and they needed a third for the endurance races for Le Mans. And fortunately, at 99, I won again with Dyson. That looked kind of good on the CV. And so talked to Don, and he was agreeable to bring me in for the third seat.
And then the next year, 2000, you return to Le Mans, this time totally different team. Mario Andretti basically takes your seat at Panoz. They run the same car the next year in 2000, but you're back with Cadillac running with Andy Wallace again. So how did the switch happen? You jumped from Panoz to Cadillac. How did that work out?
It was run by Bill Riley, the Cadillac program. I've been driving the Ridley Scott Ford in the States with Rob Dyson for quite a few years by that point. And we had a lot of success. And I knew Bill pretty well. At the end of 99, I didn't really have a full-time drive for the next year because Rob Dyson realized that the Riley's time was getting pretty old. And he was looking at getting something else, but he wasn't really sure that he was going to. And so he was on the fence of doing anything. And so I started talking to Bill Riley and Cadillac. Yeah, so that came about. And because Andy was there too, that, I felt very good about that. And I had a lot of respect for Bill. The program itself didn't go that well. I mean, it really comes down to the engines didn't make much power. They had a directive from Cadillac that the car had to go 200 miles an hour on Mulsanne. And it did. They reached that goal. I think it was right at 200 miles an hour. And we were, I think, the second fastest car in the speed traps. But we were also 13th and 14th fastest on the actual lap times. The car just didn't make much downforce. In order to meet that goal, our cornering speed was pretty poor. Reliability wasn't great either. We ran Daytona and Sebring before Le Mans, had a lot of problems, a lot of gearbox problems. They had to actually re-engineer the back of the car and use a different gearbox from what we started with. The tires weren't really the right tires to be using. At Le Mans, if you're not on Michelin, it's almost a waste of time. I worked with some really great people for that, but it was, a lot of great people bashing their heads against the wall because we just weren't fast enough.
So what I'm hearing is you were really missing the Panoz at that point.
Yeah, the Panoz was good. The open top Panoz in 99 was a brand new car. I'm going to forget the designer's name, but basically cut the top off the car, but obviously did a lot of other engineering on the car as well. But it really was a missile. I mean, it was a really good, fast car. Robert Yates did the engines and they made a ton of power. It was a really good car. It was very odd driving, but both the original Panoz and the open top car, the seating position was very far back, almost like over the rear axle. The actual feel from the car, there's a lot of movement. When you're in a normal prototype, you're just kind of behind the front wheels and you're kind of at the pendulum point between the front and rear. So you don't get that much movement, and especially in yaw. When the car starts to slide, your butt might move an inch or 2 inches in relation to the front of the car, and you kind of can scale like how much of a slide you're at. But with sitting so far back, number one, like over any bumps, there was quite a bit of movement. All the rear movement of the car, you were kind of on top of the axle. And then be a normal slide, your butt would actually be moving like, maybe a foot compared to the front axle. So like it took a long time to really trust. Could go as far as what felt like going incredibly sideways with the car, but it was actually the same amount, but you were so much farther back. It was changing your perspective.
So at this point, you're becoming a household name at Le Mans. In 94 as the tire guy, in the 97, 99, 2000. Now we've reached 2001. And you switch teams again and you end up at Bentley. So how did that play out?
And that again was through James and Andy. James had done a lot of the testing for Bentley with Richard Lloyd's program. And both James and Andy had driven the Audi R8C in 1999 when I was in the Panoz. And again, it was a situation where they needed a third driver. James was very good about pointing out that Bentley's biggest market was the United States. You should have this guy on. And I certainly tried to work that angle as much as I could too. Yeah. And so I was able to convince them to give me a ride for it. Unfortunately, James ended up not doing the race with us because of some disagreements that he had. It was really unfortunate because James and Andy and I got along so well. It would have been great to share the car with him. But it was a very high stakes program because Bentley put a lot of resources into it, but only one race. It's not like you can have a bad race, but maybe have a few good races elsewhere in the year, and at the end of the year can say, well, at least we had some success. With this, everything was just piled on for Le Mans, and that was it.
That sounds like a French manufacturer that only shows up once a year.
Yes. No, it's kind of the same idea as well, because Bentley, I think the reason they were interested in the first place was just the history that Bentley had at Le Mans. It didn't really make as much sense to the board, I'm sure, to win a race at Elkhart Lake as opposed to at Le Mans. Le Mans was really the only thing that they were interested in.
Definitely an iconic win for Bentley, for them to come back and all that. But what's interesting, a couple threads we need to pull on here, because many may not know, and you touched upon something really important, which is the Audi R8C, is that at this point, Volkswagen Audi Group had purchased Bentley. And so you've got all this German backing and engineering, controlling as a small boutique British manufacturer that has racing pedigree that goes back to the beginning of cars. But the R8C was a previous generation prototype that was, I hate to say, a complete failure. It was their closed cockpit version of the original R8, always in the shadows of the BMW V12 and the Mercedes GTR and the Porsche 911 GT1 and all those kinds of cars. And it never really made a name for itself until the next generation car came out. So I think it's funny that they sort of went back and pulled the R8C out of mothballs and said, all right, we're going to change some body panels, but basic physics and core of it, it's the same car. We'll paint it green and we'll call it the Speed 8. Did you feel some of that working with Bentley, that it was like there was this shadow of Porsche and Audi looming in the background?
Oh, for sure. There was no mistaking that we were part of the Volkswagen Group, but it still was kind of a bunch of British people working under the Volkswagen umbrella.
Garagistas, right?
Yeah, the group RTN was the people who built the car. Peter Ellery was the designer, both of the R8C and the Bentley. But it was from 99 with the R8C to 2001 when we had the Bentley. It was a complete redesign because obviously, as you said, I hate to say failure, but it was certainly not a success. They had a lot of trouble. My friends were driving the car, so I was paying attention to it. And I saw it was in the pits a lot when it was even running. I know they even had like doors come flying off. Yeah, it was just one of those things where, it was another 1 year program only for Le Mans. And I know they had very little testing. They tried to do testing when we were at Paul Ricard, and they spent very little time actually on track. I think that they learned a lot of what not to do with the first car. And Peter was able to design a really nicely balanced and also very pretty car with the Bentley, with the EXP.
The Bentley was a prototype, and Audi was also there with the R8 Roadster, right? The R8R at the same time. And so people are like, well, Bentley won, but Audi won. And they're both, wait, so there's more than one class, but it wasn't like today where it's LMP1 GTP now and LMP2, and there used to be P3 and all these kinds of things. So you were in LMP 900, and then the Audi R8 was in LMP1. But you were still fighting for an overall win because the cars were that close, right?
Yeah, they had different classes, categories, and they each had a different trophy. We were really the only ones in the LMP 900. We finished third overall. I got a trophy that says first place on it from Le Mans, but the reason we were there was to win overall. So Bentley was very happy with that first year result. Had kind of told us that, anything in the top 10, like really finishing the race was the most important thing, because it was really a 3-year program. Finishing the race, top 10 would be good, top 5 would be great, was kind of like what we were built up to. So to get on the podium was pretty huge. But in our minds, we placed third, because the reason we were there was to compete against the Audis. The organizers had done their best to try to equalize what a lap time would be between the two different cars. We had a smaller tire, but a little bit better aerodynamics, a little bit bigger restrictor. In their view, we should be pretty close. And we were pretty close. So it actually did a pretty good job with that. But yeah, so we placed third. We actually had quite a few problems in the race. 2001 was a year that it rained cats and dogs for quite a bit of it. And one of the air intakes for the shifting mechanism took on a lot of water and failed on both the cars. On our team car, that was Guy Smith, Martin Brundle, and Stefano Ortelli, it failed enough that it was stuck in sixth, and they weren't able to make it back without burning out the clutch. With me, it happened a few times, and I kept carrying on. You could kind of trick it a little bit with grabbing the clutch and shifting at the same time. You could take some load off of it and it would still shift. But eventually it did stick, but it stuck in fourth gear. So I was able to make it back to the pits, and then we did a swap on it. And I think the swap probably took, I want to say, like 40 minutes, or maybe not that long, but it might have been like a 20-minute stop. So we lost a lot of time with that.
You didn't have the Audi advantage of unbolting the whole rear end and putting a new one on within the context of a lap and then going back out?
No, we did not. And that was really disappointing. And in fact, with the problems that we had, we dropped back quite a bit, but we were coming back, and other cars were having problems, and we're getting up the leaderboard pretty quickly. At one point I heard over the loudspeaker, oh, the transmission problems for the Audi. Yes. All right. Okay. Like, there's one down. And then, a couple minutes later, it's back on the track. Yeah. So that really kind of took some of the air out as well.
Well, it blew everybody's mind. We all saw it live. We're like, what are they? Did they just do what I think they did?
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty disappointing, because if they weren't out of the race altogether, they're going to be down for a while. In the rain, I remember at least one of them, when I was like walking to do one of my stints, I looked up at the TV. One of the cars was in the gravel. So I thought, okay, well, at least it's going to be, a little bit before they can dig him out. But the bloody marshals were super enthused at that point, and I think they got the car out. Probably only lost like 30 seconds with that. We didn't have as much luck as we needed to try to get back onto equal footing.
So when you look back at this point to your previous runs at Le Mans, you're driving this, we'll put air quotes around British, but, German DNA prototype car. Was it a leap and a bound different despite all its problems that it had? Did you enjoy driving some of the previous cars more, or was the Bentley at that point like that was the car?
The Bentley was probably my favorite of all the cars that I drove there. Not just because of the success, but it was a really nicely balanced car. It did everything very well. There weren't really any bad habits. Just comparing to the other cars, like the Panoz Roadster, number one was pretty slow, but also extremely hot, extremely loud. I think most of my hearing exited between that year and then 99 also with the Panoz, because the cars were excruciatingly loud. In fact, in 97, we drivers, James and Andy and I, we single stinted. And the main reason was just because of the noise was so bad. It felt like you were in a war zone or something. It was just like, it was almost hard to concentrate. It was so loud. And then with the open top Panoz, this was definitely, my fault trying to be, kind of an easygoing teammate. I didn't really get the cockpit to my liking, and I was stuck up a little bit in the Airstream. And we tried to do some things with the windscreen to make it a little bit better, but that the other drivers didn't like it. So basically, I had to put a pad on my head, because my head was in the Airstream, and on straights, it would just get pinned back. So I had to have a pad on it so I could just at least rest it there. But if I started to look left or right, it would take my head like that, and try to rip it off. So I just had to keep my head dead straight and just use my eyes whenever I was going left or right, which wasn't ideal. But the car was very good. It was a little bit more brute force as opposed to get a time kind of on its own. You really had to drag it around the track, which David Brabham especially was extremely good at. And then the Cadillac just didn't really have the pace that we needed and also didn't have the downforce. So yeah, it just was never really that satisfying. But so the Bentley was definitely, of all those cars, the best of them all.
So 2002 is where it gets interesting because you return to Le Mans yet again with Bentley, and it's the same team and the same car and the same drivers and nearly the same result. But in the States, you double down and you're running Trans Am, which is nothing like the Bentley, at the same time as campaigning this car and other racing that you're doing. Tell us a little bit more about this 2002 attempt. What was the goal going into it? Was it, we did third last time, we battled it out, you're suddenly on the podium, now you want to do it again? What was the ambition of the Bentley team going in for a second year?
We were almost the victim of our own success. In 2001, things went a lot better than it was expected to. They kind of had their chart of expectations and, with ramping up with a win for the third year. But we'd done well enough that they thought, well, do we really even need to do the second year? Because they wanted a complete redesign of the car. There wasn't enough time to do top to bottom redesign of the car. And it wasn't really until, I think it was at Daytona test in January that I finally got word that, okay, we're going to Le Mans, which is only 6 months away from that. Yeah, so I went into 2002 with hardly any work, because this was another point where Rob Dyson decided that he wasn't sure that he was going to do a full season. At that time, it was, I guess, Grand Am or USRC. I can't remember what it was. But anyway, so he couldn't really commit to a full program. Bentley, going into the year, seemed about 50-50 whether they're going to be doing it. So I saw where Tom Gloy in the Trans Am series had an opening for a driver, so I called him to see if he was available. Fortunately, that worked out. And also he was agreeable to letting me go and test in France, and nothing, fortunately, collided on the schedule. So I was able to do a full commitment on both. But yeah, so when Bentley finally decided to do the program, it was with a mild update on the car. They really even said this to us, it was really just as a way to kind of keep the team together and kind of keep learning the next year, which was meant to be the year that they won. And it was known at this time even that we were always a part of Volkswagen, in the Audi group. So there was always some give and take. We were running an Audi engine. In fact, our first test in 2001 was at a track called Most in the Czech Republic. And it went really well. And Audi was testing at the same time. And we were actually matching their times. We left that test thinking, wow, we've really got something serious here. And then we never went as fast again. And I won't explain too much what I mean by that. But you might be able to kind of draw.
We'll call it balance of performance and put air quotes around that.
The car never quite seemed to have the same snap that it did at that first test either. So the idea was, and the way they carried it out as well, was for the third year, the Volkswagen kind of emphasis would go from Audi to Bentley, and that's why there were no factory Audis run. The Yost team came and ran one of the Bentleys, and they basically brought quite a bit of the Audi drivers over as well to run the cars, just because they became the primary program.
That foreshadows the 2003 season. So before we talk about your return to Le Mans in 2003, you were there to see it unfold, but you weren't part of the Bentley roster in 2003. And there's still arguments to this day. It even sits sideways sometimes with me when I think about it. The phrase is that Audi sort of gifted Bentley the win in 2003. What were your thoughts about Bentley's third and final in their program, as you knew they were going to do 3 years, that, okay, so they clinched it in that third year, but was it really theirs? Let's sort of settle the debate, I suppose.
The Volkswagen Group definitely, the favored mark for that year was Bentley for sure. But having said that, the car that Peter Ellery penned for that year was a brilliant car. It was a beautiful car, just like, being outside the program at that point, but watching it, it looked really impressive. And they went to Michelin tires, which was an improvement. Yeah. And then the competition, it went all to privateer Audis. I'm not sure if I remember right, but I think maybe the balance of performance had been shifted a bit as well, where the Audis got a little bit of a haircut on their restrictor as well. So there was definitely a favored son there. They also executed really well, and by having Yost run one car and Richard Lloyd's team run the other car, there was still competition between the two. It wasn't even like two cars just going around in formation for the entire race. You had rivalries, British group over here and the German group over here. So there were definitely both sides really trying to push their own side through. I don't think they weren't necessarily gifted anything, but there was definitely most favorable situation of the 3 years that they had.
Do you feel like you missed out not being one of the drivers selected, or was there a reason to go to Ferrari instead?
Well, no, I went to Ferrari just because I didn't have anything else. That I also was very happy to get a ride with the GT team, but I would have loved, and I pleaded my case as much as I could, but they were pretty set that they wanted a more or less British car guy, and David, and well, no, actually David was in the other car, but it was obvious that they were going to be bringing some of the Audi drivers over as well. And, I can't really blame them because they were fantastic drivers. And if this is the 1 year that you have to win Le Mans, I can certainly see their argument that you want to have people that have won Le Mans before. So I didn't take it too hard, but God, it would have been great.
And we've heard from other legends that have been on the show, whether it was, David Murray or it was Adrian Fernandez, that have made the transition from LMP down to the production classes versus somebody like Andy Pilgrim, who's super comfortable, behind the wheel of a Corvette versus going the other way. What I've heard as a kind of a consensus from those drivers that it wasn't like it was a step down, it was different. And we talked about how much time they spent being maybe more situationally aware, driving in their mirrors. It's just a whole different atmosphere because of the speed differential. So when you step down from LMP1, let's say, down into the production classes with the Ferrari, did you have the same experience where suddenly you're like, man, I'm not used to all these cars ganging up on me? And like you said, you're one of the jammer cars,
right,
out on track. Was it like that for you?
Not really. I grew up doing GT racing. I'd spent quite a bit of time in that role before I went to prototype, so it wasn't completely foreign to me. But having said that, driving high horsepower cars, high downforce cars can also maybe make you a little bit lazy, exploiting like everything that they have, and maybe not using all the momentum that you have because you've got 700 horsepower to dig you out of the turn. All of a sudden when you've got 400 horsepower, little tires, and no downforce, it becomes much more critical to be really tidy with everything. And so like that was probably the biggest challenge, was being inch perfect everywhere and not kind of like trying to drag a time out of it, but kind of like really like letting the car do what it wants.
Had you driven a Ferrari before this point? And the reason I bring it up is to compare it to coming off of a Trans Am season in a Corvette. What was that like?
Yeah, there was like nothing similar between the two. That was the only time I drove a Ferrari, even since, I think, actually. But it was very different. The setup on the car was very soft as opposed to what I was maybe more used to with prototypes. It took a lot of getting used to. Yeah, and I honestly, I wasn't the fastest driver on the team either because I was kind of coming into it a little bit cold like that. But even so, we were doing really well. There's a problem with the Porsches that year. I think they had a fuel problem or something like that, or maybe a fuel pump problem. We found ourselves leading into the night at some point anyway, that we were leading. But then we had an engine blow. Someone came when I was sleeping in the little cubicle, informed me that the engine was blown up. So we didn't only lasted probably less than 10 hours in that one. But it was good to go back there and have a perspective from the GT because all the others were being in the top class. So yeah, it was an interesting way to do it.
6 attempts at Le Mans, tons of challenges, weather conditions, changing teams, so many things that you've been probably thinking about in preparation for this. And we like to ask the legends that come on the show, when you take all that into consideration, when you look at it now, maybe with rose-colored glasses in some respects, your Le Mans journey is longer than a lot of other drivers. Some people it's one and done, and then you got others that have done it, a dozen times and so on. But when you look back over those 6 attempts, what do you think Le Mans taught you? Did it make you a better driver when you went into your other series?
I think so. Yeah. Well, I suppose the biggest thing is just being able to kind of handle the pressure of such a big event, especially on the Bentley side, where, there was an enormous amount of resources that were put behind this one team. There was only one race, so the stress and the pressure builds up every day, leading up to the race. And then the actual weekend itself, it gets pretty crazy. All of the PR people freaking out, just as much as everyone's feeling the pressure and kind of showing it. So I think one of the biggest things is just being able to absorb that much pressure and go out and do what you're supposed to do. And then the other part, like we talked about earlier, was just because at Le Mans you don't have traffic so much to deal with. There's a much higher emphasis on lap times throughout all 24 hours, as opposed to survival, having to shift the whole attitude from just having a car together to race the last few hours, where at Le Mans, you're really from the beginning of the race just going as hard as you can and just hoping and assuming that the car is going to put up with it. And if not, it's the car's fault. The driver at Le Mans isn't meant to really take care of the car so much as to just extract every bit of speed out of it.
So even before the first time you went to Le Mans as the tire guy in 1994, you mentioned that you had always wanted to race at Le Mans. And I've interviewed plenty of other up and coming drivers that say the same thing. Le Mans is one of the crown jewels, part of the triple crown of motorsport for that matter. And they wanted to race at Le Mans and they haven't been able to get there yet. Having been there 6 times yourself, what advice would you give based on all your experiences to these up and coming drivers that want to go to Le Mans?
First would be do it, like whatever you can, like put a lot of effort into finding it, whatever path you can do to get there, whether that means having success in prototype or GT racing, like in IMSA here or in the European series, and find out who's going. Like the way I got the Ferrari drive was just looking at the entry list and seeing which cars didn't have a third driver, and then starting to make phone calls. Well, I'm sure it's not quite as simple as that anymore. I think deals are done, much earlier maybe than they used to be. This was probably, I want to say maybe in March or so, maybe April even, when I made the deal for the Ferrari. So it was quite late. Whereas now it seems like all the teams, when the entry is announced 4 or 5 months ahead of time, like they've already got all the drivers set up. But the biggest thing with racing is really relationships. As I said, how I got into it with having a relationship with James and Andy, and then David Price, and just kind of knowing people so that whenever your name does come up, it can click and they can say, oh, okay, well, yeah, actually that makes sense. As opposed to whenever they have to say, who is that? That doesn't help. Whatever you can do to get your name out there, whatever success you can get, I think helps in being chosen for a drive at Le Mans, because everyone is very selective, because it is, a huge event, but also a huge expense for whatever team is doing it. I don't imagine that it's changed a lot, but I know that Rob Dyson used to say that when he was looking at possibly entering Le Mans, the budget for doing the one race was the same as doing an entire year. No one's going to make just kind of an offhand choice. Every choice is going to be very thought out. So, you need to make your case as strong as you possibly can to get the opportunity.
Watching Rolex, watching Le Mans, or even the 24 hours of the Nürburgring, it's a lot to swallow for some people. There's some diehards, like in the ACO USA. We try to stay up as long as we can to watch the race and watch you guys compete. But you got a lot of folks out there that are coming into motorsport by way of things like Drive to Survive and Formula One and other channels and disciplines of motorsport. So if somebody asks you, Butch, I heard you raced at Le Mans, I don't know if I can stomach watching this type of racing. What would you say to them to get them excited to watch something like the 24?
I've been to Le Mans a couple of times since with Michelin, where Michelin rewards some of their best dealers with a trip to France and with their spouse, and they take in the event, and no one ever comes away from that disappointed. It's amazing. There's nothing like seeing cars go that speed at night. Just like visually, the sensory overload as the cars burst through the darkness and come screaming past you, and just all of your senses are just so completely attuned to, and being assaulted really as the car goes by you. It's something very special. And if you ever get any chance to go to Le Mans, to visit Le Mans, definitely take it. If you can do it with a package, it's even better. If it's some kind of group where you can get tours and get behind the scenes, it's so much better. But yeah, it's an event. It's like, I've been like the Preakness horse race and like Indy 500, even just standing there, in the grandstands or in the infield at the Preakness, the buzz of the people, there's like electricity in the air. You really feel like you're at an event. It's not just like going to a sporting event. It's going to this really significant event where I think they have like 200,000 people are there watching it. You really feel like you're a part of something. Anyone who goes there will not come back disappointed.
Well, I'm glad you opened the door to talk about being part of something as we wrap up here. So if you could transport Butch from the past to the current season, the last couple of years of cars, is there anything you would drive that's out there on the track now?
I wouldn't drive it very well, probably. I'd definitely try to maybe not let anyone know it was me, because I'd probably embarrass myself. But I am very interested, though, in the modern prototypes and the hybrid systems, and just everything that goes into it. And honestly, I try to watch some of the racing on TV, and I've never really seen very good explanations on what are the drivers doing, what are the teams telling them to do, like how much is automatic, but how are they balancing all these different systems. I'm very curious on the technical side how all that works together and how much the driver is actually doing with it. I have seen the cars though, and they're incredibly impressive with the hybrid system and the ICE engines. They absolutely just explode off the line. Coming out of a slow turn, the acceleration is just mind-blowing. Yeah, that would be probably the thing that I would like the most, is just to be able to feel the acceleration that the modern cars have.
This year, next couple seasons are going to be a big to-do because Aston Martin is back. Ford has announced that they're coming back to LMP GTP. Do you think Bentley's going to make a return in the future? What are your thoughts on that?
Obviously, I don't have any inside knowledge, but I do know that they looked at LMP2, can't remember how many years ago, but I want to say like maybe 6 years ago, 5 years ago, before COVID anyway. And at the time, it seemed kind of odd to me, but I think they probably knew at the time that basically the prototypes were kind of going towards LMP2 kind of size, and then with the hybrids and all that. So I wouldn't put it past them. I know the Volkswagen board is keen to keep Bentley known as a performance brand. That was the reason that we went in the first place. It was that when Volkswagen purchased Bentley, at the time, they morphed into like, it's kind of Rolls Royce, but not really. They had a hard time kind of saying what they really stood for, I think. And Volkswagen Group came in and said, we need to reestablish what Bentley is. And, I think it worked really well. I think when you see a Bentley, it actually has some basis for the performance behind it, like it actually has history, so and it's not only ancient history, it's also modern history. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, every few years, maybe every 10 years or something like that, they decide that they need to kind of freshen that up and go back. I hope they do, because it's great. One of the coolest things when I was with Bentley is we did some factory visits, and it was just great to go to Crewe, these old brick buildings, where they built Spitfire engines during the war. But actually to see like the way that they're assembling these cars, like seeing the wood be cut for the dashes and the leather selected, it was cool to see cars still made by people's hands. If the Volkswagen Group can justify it, I'm sure that there's still people at Bentley that want to go back to Le Mans.
This year is also a big year for Le Mans because it's going to be the 12th running of the Classic. It's been a while since the Classic. So if you got an invite to go run one of your previous Le Mans entries, would you do it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I'm doing some of that now on stateside, where a gentleman named Juan Gonzalez has actually one of the Cadillac, more modern 2017 Cadillacs that he and I drive over here. We just did the Sebring Classic. It's a great way just to go out and have some fun behind the wheel and no pressure. Just to enjoy reliving some glory days. No, yeah, that's absolutely. If there's any chance to get back to Le Mans, I'll definitely take it.
Well, I'm glad to see that you're still out there racing, Butch. And I think you need to update your business card to say Butch Leitzinger to Le Mans and beyond.
That sounds good.
Well, as we wrap this out, I want to pass the torch to our ACO ambassador, Mei Lee, for some closing thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Butch, for your time here and sharing your wisdom and your stories. It's been very enlightening and very enjoyable. And thanks again to Eric for the excellent hosting for the event. Thanks to all the ACO members who've dialed in. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
And on behalf of everyone here and those listening at home, thank you, Butch, for sharing your stories with us. We took a deep dive into the incredible journey of Butch Leitzinger and his 6 attempts at conquering the 24 Hours of Le Mans. From his near victory with Bentley in 2001 to the challenges and triumphs that defined his career, Butch's story is one of perseverance, passion, and resilience in the face of adversity. A special thanks to Butch for sharing his experience with us and giving us a closer look at what it truly takes to race at Le Mans. His podium finish in 2001 will forever be remembered as one of the most remarkable moments in endurance racing. So we hope you enjoyed this presentation and look forward to more Evening with a Legend throughout the season. And with that, Butch, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, sharing your stories with us. And I have to say, it feels really odd to say this, but I grew up watching you race, and it's been an absolute honor to sit down and listen to you and talk about your stories. So thank you for sharing.
That's very kind of you. I appreciate that, Eric. I had a great time. Thanks. I'm happy to do it at any time.
And keep turning laps.
Right on.
This episode has been brought to you by the Automobile Club of the West and the ACO USA. From the awe-inspiring speed demons that have graced the track to the courageous drivers who have pushed the limits of endurance, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is an automotive spectacle like no other. For over a century, the 24 Hours Le Mans has urged manufacturers to innovate for the benefit of future motorists, and it's a celebration of the relentless pursuit of speed and excellence in the world of motorsports. To learn more about or to become a member of the ACO USA, look no further than www.lemans.org. Click on English in the upper right corner, and then click on the ACO Members tab for club offers. Once you've become a member, you can follow all the action on the Facebook group ACO USA Members Club and become part of the legend with future Evening with the Legend meetups. This episode has been brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports as part of our Motoring Podcast Network. For more episodes like this, tune in each week for more exciting and educational content from organizations like the Exotic Car Marketplace, the Motoring Historian, Break Fix, and many others. If you'd like to support Grand Touring Motorsports and the Motoring Podcast Network, sign up for one of our many sponsorship tiers at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. Please note that the content, opinions, and materials presented and expressed in this episode are those of its creator, and this episode has been published with their consent. If you have any inquiries about this program, please contact the creators of this episode via email or social media as mentioned in the episode.